The war in Ukraine has changed the world. And now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project ReInforceUA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on ReInforceUA.com.
Dear colleagues, friends in Ukraine and from all the world, I'm Vyacheslav Pokatila, and on behalf of Hult International Business School, MIM Kyiv, welcome you on ReInforceUA project, which was designed to inspire Ukrainian business community in this very difficult and interesting time simultaneously, and to bring those ideas which are at the moment in the agenda worldwide. And we invited the famous leaders, thoughtful people, professors from all over the world to share their opinion about a subject matter that's currently widely discussed worldwide. We are grateful for our sponsors to this project who made it possible: Bogdan Havrilyshin Family Foundation, 50 Thinkers Organization, and 3 global associations of management education: AACSB, AMBA, and EFMD. We are grateful for all donations you have made while registering on our platform, and please be aware that all collected money will be directed to support temporarily displaced women from Ukraine who are going to start their own businesses. Before I shall give the floor to our honorable guest today, I'd like to remind you that this webinar is recorded, and the record will be available afterwards. And you will be able now to ask questions, but for this purpose, I kindly ask you to use Q&A button rather than chat. And now I have a privilege to introduce and to welcome our eminent guest, Dr. Megan Reitz. Dr. Reitz is Professor of Leadership and Dialogue in Hult International Business School, where she speaks, researches, consults, and supervises on the intersection of leadership, change, dialogue, and mindfulness. She has written Dialogue in Organization and My Time, and her most recent book with Financial Times Publishing is called Speak Up, which was shortlisted for the CMI Management Book of the Year 2 years ago. She's a regular contributor to Harvard Business Reviewers, and her research has recently featured in Forbes, on the BBC, on TEDx Talk, and in numerous academic and practical-based journals. Professor Reitz, welcome in our project. Thank you very much for finding the time to join us, and I have a privilege to give you the floor.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. It is a real privilege to be here with you this evening, and I'm going to spend some time talking about a project that I've been involved with my research partner, John Higgins, for about 10 years, nearly 10 years now. And we're going to talk today for about half an hour about your habits, okay? Not all of them, I'm pleased to say. We're going to talk about something I call conversational habits. So you and I have habits around when we speak up and when we stay silent. And we also have habits around who we listen to and who we don't. And those habits pretty much define our lives. They define our careers. But also, as well as individual habits, our teams and our organizations have habits around what gets said and who gets heard. And they do have very big consequences. So what gets said and who gets heard affects whether organizations end up on the front page of the newspaper for the wrong reasons, because somebody spoke up and wasn't heard, or somebody didn't speak up. So big consequences on ethical conduct and compliance. But our conversational habits affect innovation. So I wonder, in the team that you're in, is it a habit for people to stick up their hand and say, I've got an idea? Is it a habit for people to stick up their hand and say, I disagree. I have a different view on this. I'd like to challenge the way we're thinking. If you have those sorts of habits, you can be amongst the most innovative organizations in the world. So I've been studying all these consequences. And of course, I've also studied situations where conversational habits cost lives. So they cost lives if we can't talk about safety, cost lives if we can't talk about mental health at work, cost lives when sectors of society are silenced. And the thing is, our day-to-day choices and habits around whether to say something or not can seem very unimportant, mundane. But if we have the same habits over the next year or the next 5 years, that's when small habits end up having really quite big consequences. So I'm going to talk you through some of our key findings for the next while. But before I do that, I want to mention 2 big mistakes that organizations are making in this area, because this whole area is part of psychological safety, which is one of the hottest topics in leadership and management at the moment. Is it safe for employees to speak up with ideas, to speak up when they've made a mistake, to speak up if they've seen something happen that shouldn't be happening? And there's these 2 big mistakes I see a lot of. So here's the first one. About 8 years ago, when I started this project, a leader knocked on my door and said to me, Megan, we've got a bit of a problem in this organization because those people, they aren't speaking up. I need them, pointing at the employees, I need them to be brave, be courageous, speak up. So I went to talk to they over there, and this is the first quote I gathered in my research on this topic, and it came from they. Last time somebody spoke up around here, they disappeared. So right from the start, it was obvious that yes, of course, we need courage to speak up. Yes, we need to try and do that as effectively as possible. But unless we are focused on whether somebody is listening and whether there's a good invitation to speak up, it's a complete waste of time. So speaking up is relational. I speak up depending on how you show up. So as a leader and a manager, how you show up affects other people's voices. And so often we point at them and think that it's their fault, whereas actually it's a relationship. So I'm actually going to talk a lot about listening up today. Here's the second really interesting trend happening. Leaders and managers are asking employees to speak up. They're saying things like, bring your whole self to work. Lovely invitation. Some employees in some countries in particular, and in some industries, hear this invitation and they say, oh, okay, I will, thank you. Let's talk about race. Let's talk about gender. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about these topics because they matter. That's bringing my whole self to work. And I was speaking to a finance director the other day who said to me confidentially, he said, I asked my team to speak up because I was kind of hoping for more transparency on compliance issues. I was hoping for some good ideas. I didn't realize I'd get everything else. But we're in an era of what we call employee activism. And I've written about that a lot over the last year or so. So when we invite employees to speak up, are we ready to have the conversations that they then want to have? I'll refer a bit to that later on in the presentation too. So let me ask you a question. Bring to mind something that you feel you could or should speak up about at work, but you haven't yet. So maybe you've got some feedback for somebody that you haven't said. Maybe you have an idea you haven't voiced. So bring something to mind. And my question is, why haven't you spoken up? What's stopping you? Well, I've asked thousands and thousands of people that question. And we created something that we call the truth framework. And the truth framework identifies 5 factors that affect whether we speak up or not, and whether we listen up or not. And if we want to change our habits, we need to know why we do what we do in the first place. And that's what the truth framework's about. So I'll quickly go through this. I'm going to pause on 2 of them in particular. When we're speaking up, we need to trust in the value of our opinion. So for many of us, we want to have the evidence to speak up, and it's got to matter enough. But trust is also the starting point of listening. I'm not going to listen to you unless I trust in the value of your opinion. And we trust some people's opinions about some topics sometimes. So trust is kind of the starting point. As soon as I think to myself, right, I've got something to say, it's important, the very next thing that goes through our mind is what will happen if I say it? What's the risk of speaking up? And we have stories around the consequences. Usually we think to ourselves, well, what happened last time I spoke up? What happened last time a colleague spoke up? Did it end well? Do I want to do that again? And we have stories from our childhood. When I was growing up, did I learn that it was okay to speak up? Or did I learn that that wasn't something to do? So we have stories in our minds about risks. 2 of the biggest risks that stop people from speaking up are the fear of being perceived negatively and the fear of upsetting or embarrassing the other person. Because we're social beings, we like to be in relationship. If we're a leader or a manager, it's really helpful that we understand how risky it can feel for other people to speak to us. I'm going to focus more on that in just a bit. Understanding stands for power and politics. So speaking up is a political act. It affects people's agendas. And the more we're aware of that, the more able we are to navigate speaking up effectively. This is a big topic, politics and power. It's also big if you're listening up. If you're listening, there's a whole pile of politics going on that means you get to hear what you get to hear. And there was one of my most memorable interviews with another a chief operating officer at one of the global banks, who told me that it got to the point in the bank when there was the financial crisis, it got to the point where the only people that believed in the data that the board was receiving was the board. So in other words, this data was fed up to managers but it was made to look a little bit better than it really was because of politics. And this happened again and again and again until the board was receiving information that was very disconnected to what was actually going on. So that's understanding politics and power. Next one, I want to pause a bit here, titles and labels. So if you cast your mind back 10 minutes, 10 minutes ago, I was introduced and I came up on your screen. My picture came up on your screen and you looked at me. And at that moment, you labeled me. You may not remember that, but you did. You will have labeled me female, British, white, professor. You labeled me, you're still labeling me on my age, on my appearance. We label one another all the time on so many different things. Really interesting thing about titles and labels is that they help us to construct relative status and authority. And that is the one thing that really impacts whether we choose to speak up or whether we choose to listen. It's our understanding of relative power and status. And these labels mean different things in different contexts. So I can work in one organization where if you've got a label that says HR, it's high status. People listen to you. It's easy to speak up. And I can work in another organization where if you're from HR, it's low status and you don't get heard. I can work in an organization where if you've been there 20 years, high status. People really listen. You feel able to speak up. And then I work in organizations where if you've been there 20 years, nobody listens to you anymore. You've been there too long. So it's the same title can mean very different things in different places. Now, here's the main thing I want you to remember from titles and labels. When we have the titles and labels that convey status in a particular situation, we're very often the last person to notice the impact those labels have on other people's ability to speak up. So, for example, as you become more senior, you often forget how intimidating you become. Everybody else knows it. Everybody else that doesn't have those labels are able to look at you and go, oh, that label makes a real difference. But when we're the one with a label, it's tricky to see. And we call that advantage blindness. And it matters because we underestimate how difficult it is for people to speak up to us. So that's titles and labels, really fascinating area. Final part of the truth framework is H, which stands for how to. I may want to speak up, but unless I know how to, unless I have a person I can speak to, unless there's a forum, I may stay silent. Similarly, I may want to listen, but unless I know how to do that, then I may not be very effective. In our research, we've got a model called the 5 W's. And there's the 5 W's of speaking up and of listening up. I'll share the listening up here. 5 W's stands for who, why, what, where, and when. Whose voice do I need to hear that I'm not hearing at the moment, and why? What verbal and body language should I use to help people to feel safe and to speak to me? And where and when should I make this invitation to be really effective? And just to give you an example here, I recently worked with 2 managers that both wanted feedback from their team on a new strategy that they developed. And the first manager presented the strategy in a big town hall meeting, and he was standing on the stage. And at the end of the presentation, he clapped his hands together and he looked at everybody and he said, right, feedback. That was how he invited people to speak up, and nobody said a word. Far too intimidating. Another manager I work with, again, showed a new strategy, but to a much smaller group, much more informal. And then she did something really interesting. She asked some people in the group to step into the shoes of their most ruthless competitor. Then she said, okay, to another group of people, could you step into the shoes of our most discerning customer? And then could you please step into the shoes of our junior employees? And she said, okay, from those positions, what would be the top 2 or 3 challenges you'd have to the strategy that I just presented? So very different question, very different environment, very different body language led to different sorts of conversations. So that's the 5 W's and the how to, and you can read lots more about that in some of the other articles that I've written. Now, let me just share some data with you, because I want to talk about speaking up, but then mainly listening up. We've surveyed about 13,000 people globally on speaking up and listening up. Here's a section of the data that I've been working with recently. We ask people, do junior employees at your organization speak up? Do you think they speak up? Do they speak up about malpractice? Do they speak up to challenge ways of working? Do they offer ideas? Do they speak up about wider social and environmental issues? And then we ask people, okay, do your senior employees speak up? And if so, how much? So 54% of our respondents think that junior employees would usually or always speak up about malpractice. Much more optimistic about senior employees. 81% of people think that senior employees would. Half of our respondents think that junior employees would speak up to offer ideas. I also ask people whether they would speak up. So that's their perceptions of others. What about them? This is what they self-report. 88% of respondents say that they would usually or always speak up about malpractice. Even more to offer ideas, a bit less to challenge ways of working, and quite a lot less at the moment around social and environmental issues. So as you look at this data, I wonder what you see. I wonder whether you're surprised or not, whether you think this is positive data or not. And I wonder what patterns you might see in it. Let me share a couple that we see, and we see these in nearly every organization we've ever studied, and across cultures as well. So first thing is to note is that we often talk in very generalized terms about speaking up. Can people speak up? What we'll find is, yes, they can speak up about some things, but less so about other things. And those are the patterns that we need to see. I was with a German organization recently who had very high numbers there in the malpractice. So employees would always speak up on compliance issues. They'd done really, really well. But employees weren't speaking up about challenging ways of working or offering ideas. And their strategy was to transform the organization. And they weren't going to transform anything unless they looked at people speaking up in those particular areas. We think that senior people will speak up more than juniors, which is perhaps unsurprising, but it has consequences. Our junior employees are often where the action is. They see mistakes, they see opportunities, but they're the least likely group to speak up because they are the group that expects the most negative consequences. Something you can't see in this data, because I didn't want to give too many numbers, but the more senior you are, and the more white and the more male you are, the higher these numbers. In other words, the more senior white male you are, the more likely you are to say and to think that others are speaking up in your organization when they're not necessarily. More about that in just a bit. So you're more optimistic, basically. Then we get to the self-assessment. So aside from the bottom category, which is an interesting one, which we're looking at, we tend to rate ourselves highly on speaking up, but also on listening up. Some norm data here about listening up. We asked people, do senior people in your organization listen? And if so, what to? And do you listen? So 87% of our respondents think that those in senior roles would usually or always listen to an issue of malpractice. Less likely with ideas and less likely, again, challenging ways of working, or if you are speaking up about social and environmental issues. But look what happens when we ask our respondents whether they listen. Do you listen? Yes. Apparently all my respondents are brilliant listeners. Now, what happens here, this has got a name, it's called the superiority illusion. It's a great name. We rate ourselves on our intent, and we rate others on their behavior. And there's a gap, particularly with listening. And it's a problem because we all think we're really good at listening. It's other people that need to get better. But we all think that. And so nobody really does anything different. So we've got this interesting situation where, let's take senior people, for example. As you get more senior, you tend to forget that you're not very approachable. And you'll overestimate the degree to which people are speaking up to you. You'll also overestimate your listening skills. And that means you can get into what I call an optimism bubble. You're thinking people are speaking up, you're thinking people are talking to you and telling you the things that you need to hear when they're not necessarily. So the question comes, how do you burst the bubble? And what are the consequences of staying in the bubble? Well, let me give you an example of some of the consequences. One area that we've been researching over the last year is employee activism, which is really employees speaking up about wider social and environmental issues. And this is a really hot topic, pretty much everywhere, but especially in the US. And we've looked at how organizations and leaders respond. And we created a taxonomy, and I'll give you some references if you're interested in looking up more on this. But there's non-existent, which is when an issue isn't even on the agenda. It's just not anywhere. Suppression is when voices are actively stopped and silenced, either because they're told not to speak about it, or people know that if they do speak up, they'll lose their job. That's suppression. There's something we call facadism, which is when leaders and managers say all the right things, but it's a facade. It's a kind of veneer. Nothing actually changes, nothing happens. So I say the right things, but there's no action underneath, no real intent. Defensive engagement is when organizations and leaders do engage on a topic, but only because they really have to. And they do the minimum, the kind of the legal requirement. Then there's a step change to dialogue, dialogic engagement. And this is when leaders and managers know that they don't know the answer. So they're really curious and they're sharing information and sharing decision-making, which is a big step. And finally, there are the Ben and Jerry's and the Patagonias of the world that stimulate activism. So they recruit activists, they promote activists, they are an activist organization. So I've asked several thousand, about 7,000 people, how is your organization responding to employee activism? And this is some norm data that we're gathering. The main thing I want to tell you here, there's a lot to say about this topic, but I'll mention one thing. The more senior you are, and the more white, and the more male, the more likely you are to say that your organization's response is dialogue or stimulating activism. In other words, proactive. And that's a consequence of the optimism bubble. Because when we have some of the labels that are higher status, our experience is that we can speak up and that we get listened to. And so we tend to generalize. We think that that experience is shared when it isn't. And this is a big issue for organizations right now, because we've got management teams that think they're in dialogue when their employees aren't experiencing it that way, and that spells problems. So how do you, if you're a leader or a manager, how do you start to burst this bubble? Well, let me leave you with 3 traps that I've studied a lot. And I wonder which of these might resonate with you, and maybe which one would you look out for after this session. So number 1 trap, we forget how scary we are. I've spoken about that quite a bit. Our last article for Harvard Business Review was titled, "Managers, You're More Intimidating Than You Think." So we need to see ourselves as other people see us. And then we need to do the work to put people at their ease. Our first article actually with Harvard was titled, "The Problem with Saying My Door is Always Open." So again, we tend as senior, as leaders, we say, my door is always open. But we forget how scary it is to come into our office. So who might find you a little bit intimidating? That's your question. Second trap, we interviewed a chief executive who wanted his team to speak up. And midway through the interview, he paused and he said, but I do have a little list in my head of the people that I go to and that I listen to and the people that I don't. And we all have our little lists of people that we go to a lot. Of course we do, because we trust them. So it's not about getting rid of these little lists. That would be impossible. And maybe we wouldn't want to. But it is about questioning them and saying, hang on, why are these the people I always listen to and go to for advice? And do they look a lot like me? In other words, am I in an echo chamber? And I'm just listening to people similar to me. And why are these people over here? And this territory includes unconscious bias. And we really need to question ourselves, particularly as managers and leaders, but more widely. How do we engage in difference? How do we reach out and be challenged, even if that feels uncomfortable? So the second trap is, are you in an echo chamber? That's the question. Final trap, we send what I call shut up signals rather than speak up ones. And I use myself as an example here, because I have something that politely we might call the listening face. It goes a bit like this. So when I'm really interested, I'll kind of frown. And that's fine if you know me, but if you don't know me, I can look a little bit intimidating. Another signal that we tend to all do is when we're on virtual meetings, doing our emails at the same time. For some reason, we all think that we can do that without anybody noticing. It's never right, is it? We always know who's doing their emails. But we send signals all the time. Do we know what signals we're sending and the impact that it has? A colleague of mine, Nancy Klein, has a great phrase. She says, know your face. What are you sending out? Particularly if somebody has just spoken up and they've challenged you, what signals do you then send in that next moment? Because those signals determine whether that person speaks up again, and probably whether their colleagues do. So do you know what signals you're sending when? So there's some ideas around how we burst this bubble. Lots more to say. I'm about to go to questions. So if you haven't put a question in the Q&A, firstly, think about why you haven't, given that I'm speaking about speaking up. But also, you know, please, I do invite you to do that. I'm just going to run through the last comments that I've gone through. Speaking up and listening up are hugely important for us personally and our organizations. We can think of culture, actually, organizational culture, in terms of conversational habits. What gets said and who gets heard. We tend to point at other people and think they should be speaking up, but it has a lot to do with us and how we show up. We looked at why we do what we do through the truth framework. I'm afraid we're not as good as we think we are, both at speaking up and listening up. And the more senior you are, the more optimistic you think people are speaking up when they're not. And if you're wanting to improve psychological safety, which is a major focus area of organizations right now, we have to look at conversational habits. What are we saying? What aren't we saying? And whose voices do we need to hear that we're not hearing right now? There's a few kind of references there and some contact details. Leave those on the screen for just a second or two. And then I will see whether we've got any questions and what we might talk about after that. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much. Well, you know, questions are appearing inside a lot. At least what I learned immediately, that to have habits of speaking up and listening to others are good, and therefore people tend to always assume themselves better, and therefore they tend to evaluate their skills much more. This is good. I mean, it exists an understanding that it's important to do. But then I would change a little bit the sequence of questions, because it immediately brings me to certain notions. Once I read the research about narcissism and learned that, you know, it is like an epidemic in the worldwide. At least some speak of this kind of epidemic. But what is more or less clear, that among chief operating officers, about 3 times more narcissism like people than in the general public. So it is good to have this kind of narcissist habits to become a CEO. But then comes the question of course, these people are great. They are listening. They are speaking up. They are allowing everybody to do everything, right? But then comes the challenge how to speak up, having such a chief executive officer, and any kind of advice. And probably from your research would be highly appreciated, because it happens. And it happens.
Oh, it does.
About 20%, according to statistics. It
does. I mean, I didn't have time here today to show some of the speak up traps, but my number one speak up trap is, you know, we don't speak up when we're not sure about our own opinion. And I have interviewed a fair number of senior leaders who could do with doubting their opinion a bit more than they do. You know, they are too sure of their own opinion, and so they're not listening to others. And I hope we are shifting the story around what good leadership looks like away from that sort of very charismatic person that knows the answer and then persuades everybody that that is the answer, towards leaders that know that their perspective is partial, that know that they have blind spots, and therefore they better reach out and be curious and ask and find out and listen to different perspectives. I hope we're shifting in that move, but I absolutely get you that many people are still stuck with managers and leaders who are maybe narcissistic, or at least certainly they're not very good at listening. Now, with this, there are nearly always things that you can do to speak up more effectively. And one thing I would direct people towards is the 5 W's of speaking up, which is: who do I need to speak to? Why? What's my positive intent? Preferably, what are they also interested in as well? What verbal and body language do I use, and when and where do I speak up? And so there's nearly always a more effective way of being heard, even when our managers and leaders aren't that easy. Sometimes you have a manager and leader, though, and I've researched them as well, who will not listen. And in that case, it can be really tricky. And then some people face the decision, of course, that they either leave or they try and kind of just stop talking, you know, and they silence themselves, which is a real shame. So it's an important area. There are usually things that you can do. And then at some point, there are also managers and leaders that are very, very difficult to work with. And I've worked with plenty of people who have decided to walk away.
Okay, aren't you too, I'll say, over-optimistic about, you know, shift of leadership perspectives? Edelman, the global communication company Edelman, published the Edelman Trust Barometer every year, and according to this barometer of this year, I mean 2021, 22nd, business at the moment is presumed to be the most efficient and the most ethical and superior to efficiency and ethics of the governments.
Yes.
Which means more than half of the people believe that business leaders, CEOs, should provide their opinion about was a wide range of things. And you also mentioned in your talk about, you know, speaking up about things which are hardly related directly to business, which create a field when, well, general managers should be sure, should provide certain opinion, should be clear to lead people towards some ideas. It's probably, well, like, you know, this is an easy subject, like, you know, environmental and climate change. It's more or less settled at the moment, the mainstream. There are less easy subjects, like in the US, recent discussion about abortion, etc., which always pushed the managers towards a risky, very shaky environment. So they have to speak up. And at the same time, otherwise, because people want them to speak up, want to provide their opinion. And at the same time, this is a risk of bringing unrest, well, quite a big unrest in organization. Mm-hmm. So would you please share a few words
I would love
about how to deal with this not an easy subject for general managers, how to speak it from the top bottom, how to communicate.
So our leaders and managers will likely be expected to speak up and make stands on far wider social and environmental issues than they ever have done in the past. Mm-hmm. And many things that we have thought of as, you know, outside the business remit are not outside the business remit for many people. Yeah, so the trying to identify, you know, what is business and what isn't business is impossible, because a topic like race or gender, for example, may feel like it's outside of business to some leaders and managers, but people within the organization will say, that is precisely related to how I show up at work and how I perform. So let's talk about it. So we are seeing far more conversations here. And this is one reason why I do think leaders are having to, first of all, realize that they don't know the answer. They don't necessarily know, with these kind of what we call wicked challenges, they don't know what to make a stand on and how to make a stand on it. So it becomes very important for them to have the ability to invite voices of difference to speak up. Now, that doesn't mean speak up about, everything and without any boundaries. But it does mean that leaders and managers need to be able to take the pulse of what matters to their employees and actually their consumers and their investors and other stakeholders. So rather than making all the decisions up here in a little leadership team, they need to quickly be able to take the pulse and take ideas from their different stakeholder groups. And I think many organizations are learning to do that a bit better now, because we say in our research, it's as dangerous now to sit on the fence, in other words, to not do anything, as it is to get off it, in other words, to make a stand. So if you don't say something on a topic of importance, that's as political and as dangerous as if you do take a stand. That doesn't mean that leaders and managers should suddenly take a stand on everything. That's impossible and wouldn't want to. But they need to show how are they making the choices that they're making. And are they doing them thoughtfully and coherently with their stakeholder groups? And that's really the key here. And that is beginning to force a change in leadership practice that I was referring to earlier.
Yeah, it would lead us to discussion about what actual organizations or companies are about, and currently it's also a great discussion whether it is about making profit or about what much wider,
yes.
wider range of things, and it yes. creates absolutely new demand also in front of the board members on who are the leaders and what are their set of values, etc. Rather than just good appearance and let's say certain skills.
Yes.
Also, in some of the talks you mentioned about use the words like productive talks versus unproductive talks, and inside the company, with all their good attitude towards letting people to show up and to speak up and to express their opinion, there could be some kind of a burden in a discussion about useless things, not helpful, creating troubles, creating distrust, creating cures everywhere, and also how, let's say, to make the difference between this and how actually to find a proper way inside the organization not to allow this, let's say, not productive talks and discussions.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about dialogue. That's an area of study. So what does dialogue mean? And that word is used randomly and tends to conjure up an idea of consensus and lovely conversations. We're in dialogue. Actually, dialogue is far more bracing, far more dangerous than that. If you're in dialogue, you're coming into conversation knowing that you don't know and knowing that there's difference and inquiring into it. And that means there'll be disagreement, there'll be mistakes, there'll be fallout. And that's why leaders and managers tend to avoid it. But I don't think we can avoid it anymore. We do need areas where we will have these sorts of conversations that aren't so rigidly managed. That doesn't mean that we can't set standards for them and boundaries. And a facilitator's role in these forums is to make sure that people are voicing different perspectives, but are doing that in a very respectful and curious way. And there are ways of, doing that far better. So it's not a kind of, let's have difficult conversations. It's let's really hold these difficult conversations and know that they won't be perfect. And the other thing I would say here is that I'm working at the moment with some leadership teams that are trying to encourage difference, respectful difference in their organization. And yet the leadership team itself is either not showing any difference of opinion, so they're not role modeling how to disagree respectfully, or the leadership team is really dysfunctional and everybody realizes that two people on the leadership team cannot respect one another at all. So they're asking the organization to be in dialogue, but they're not showing that at the top. And I think that's a really important thing to note as well. If we're asking our employees to be a certain way, then are we displaying that? Are we showing how to do that well at the senior levels? And if we're not, employees will just shrug their shoulders and go, yeah, right, heard it all before.
We have a question from the audience about whether you mentioned twice while talking about men, white, etc. Whether your research shows the difference between men and women with listening skills and ability to speak up.
Yes, so speaking up and listening up is gendered. So we know that men are likely to feel more confident in speaking up. They are more likely, a major reason for that is that they are likely to expect more positive consequences as a result of speaking up than women do. And that isn't surprising, because for centuries, women have faced more negative consequences as a result of speaking up. So these different perspectives on what will happen if we speak up is gendered, and that ends up resulting in differences around whether people speak up or feel comfortable to speak up or not. We also know that women are more likely to value others' opinions, so they are more likely to be open to difference and seeking that out. So there are some interesting gendered patterns in the data. They're not surprising, and they've shown up in other research projects as well.
We have also a question about the difference in different cultural environment, let's say political and historical habits of people in different countries may affect somehow the possibility to and skills and some kind of standards about speaking and listening. Could you add a few words? What is the most striking differences you observed or followed from your research?
So the key patterns that I just talked about, so advantage blindness, superiority illusion, thinking that senior people speak up more than junior people, those patterns are the same whether I've been studying organizations in Asia or South America or the US or Europe. What differs, and again, something that's been widely researched by many others, is what we call power difference. So different cultures have different expectations, particularly around whether it's okay to challenge authority or to disagree with authority. So there are different consequences in terms of how we speak up and how we do that effectively across different cultures. So that would be the biggest difference that I would say. In some cultures, leaders expect to be challenged, and they invite it and they are challenged more than in other cultures when it's regarded as kind of disrespectful to do that. And that has a big impact, of course, on speaking up and listening up. What I would say, one other point, is that culture, though, is just one label. And when you put cultural background next to gender and age and department and language and all of these other labels, then it becomes a very mixed picture.
And complicated.
And complicated. And interesting.
I'd like just a little bit to touch one more complicated issues related to your how-to part of framework. Unions. Yeah, from UK. It's at the moment, at present, we are witnessing this very interesting situation in the USA on another part of Atlantics. And the situation in Starbucks and other big companies, when people try to unionize and at the same time top managers from a top famous company actually oppose this kind of unionization. Having union, having organization, having certain organizational setup creates more possibilities for people to bring their opinion and for this opinion to be heard. What's your opinion about having or not having whether this organization or in particular unions, labor unions, whether it really helps and create a better culture of possibilities of people to talk to and to be listened and to be heard. I know I'm also in a business school, and I know that this is a little bit somehow challenging question for any from the business.
Well, of course, whether unions are better just depends completely on your perspective and what your definition of better means and what your intent is, and it does link a bit back into, well, what is the purpose of this organization as well? So, better depends on which viewpoint you tend to look at it, whether it needs to be a union or whether it's some other form of collective voice. Mm-hmm. We know from our research that collective voice tends to have bigger influence and bigger impact. And that's one of the things we find in speaking up. And one of the things we advise is if it's difficult to be heard, and actually going back to your previous question, if you have a leader or a manager who is difficult, one of the things you can do is collect together and speak up as a group, because that's far less risky than as an individual, and you're more likely to be heard. So whether it's a union, whether it's an employee resource group, whether it's other forms of employee collective voice, I think that they can be very useful ways of employees feeling it less risky to speak up and more likely to be heard. How they're experienced by leaders and managers, it depends on what those leaders and managers think that they are leading and managing for, I suppose, and whether they are really interested in it. I mean, it's a great label, isn't it? When managers go into a room and meet unions, those labels already convey a whole history and load of judgments and expectations. And, I wonder how we get underneath that so we get to positions of dialogue.
Yeah, thank you. You corrected my question, because I really meant some kind of organizational setup to support this culture rather than just unions. You're correct that unions, it's a whole history and a lot of levels. But I'm just impressed with what's going on and actually how managers react on possibilities of renewing the union in the USA. We still have 1 minute, so I can, or probably a little bit more, our listeners forgive us for one more question. We have a joke about exchanging opinion with your boss, coming with his own opinion and going out with him or hers opinion, and coming to the family, because there are also bosses and subordinates. How often your daughters actually convince you with their opinion, and you actually take it and actually follow sincerely, frankly, not just because you need to, but sincerely.
Yeah, what a question. So I have two daughters who are aged 11 and 13, and I often say, and I really mean it, they teach me more about mindfulness, which is another area of my research, and dialogue and speaking up and listening up than probably the rest of my research combined, actually. And it's, you know, I think looking at our family systems, it's not where my research is, but our family systems have habits around what gets said and who gets heard. And, you know, as authority, apparently, figures, as parents, you know, how do we invite our kids to speak up? And then what happens when they don't stop speaking up? There's another question. There's no time to go there, but they teach me a lot.
Okay. Professor Reitz, thank you very much. It's really a very short time to, and as I see from the chat and from resources, people enjoyed being with us today and appreciated your presentations and your sharing your opinion. So we are very thankful for your finding time and joining us today. And with this, I need to remind all our participants today that the project ReInforceUA is going on full space, and we have, we believe we would be with us until the end of the year at least. And our next meeting will be on the 5th of October, Wednesday, 6 p.m. Please note in your calendars, and our guest will be a person, everybody who actually studied in business schools should know the name, is Alexander Osterwalder. Is his famous book about business model canvas. I would not mention now all his other titles, but will be a great talk, different talks about different matters, but also great, and I invite you to join us. Also remind that you can still make donations, and these donations will be very helpful to Ukrainian temporarily displaced women who would like to start their own businesses. You have just learned that having women in charge, having women on the top organization creates a better communication environment and more attractive innovations and other goodies. So thank you once again, Professor Reitz, and thank everybody for joining us today. Have a nice day. We have difficult time in Ukraine, but we are optimistic and we know that we shall overcome. Slava Ukraini. Goodbye.
The war in Ukraine has changed the world, and now we need to think about where this world is moving to, together. That's why MIM Business School is launching the nationwide educational project ReInforceUA, where the world's greatest minds will share their ideas and insights. And you will get their experience, change your perspective, and discover what changes should the business be ready for, before and after the victory. Every week on ReInforceUA.com.